Hello everyone, my name is Mohsen Mirali, graduate student from Global Sport Management, Seoul National University. My topic is about talent development pathway of Iranian pro athletes, the role of impairment, onset and progression in para sport. So para sport has experienced substantial global growth over recent decades, becoming a major component of the international sports system. Despite this expansion, most existing athlete development frameworks remain largely derived from able-bodied sport models. So, these frameworks often assume relatively linear and standardized developmental trajectory. However, para-athlete development involves unique structural, environmental, and biological constraints that are not adequately captured by traditional models. Factors such as classification, access to the adaptive resources, and impairment related adaptation introduce additional complexity into the developmental process. So, one potentially critical yet underexplored variable within this context is the timing of the impairment onset. The onset of impairment may shape when the athletes enter the sport, how they acquire skills, and how they progress through competitive milestones. Furthermore, empirical research examining this mechanism remains heavily concentrated in a Western study. So, high income contexts and evidence from Middle Eastern and Asian sports systems remain limited. Despite the rapid growth of para sport, important challenges remain in the understanding para-athlete development. Most existing athlete development frameworks are derived primarily from the able-bodied sport models, which may not fully capture the distinctive pathway experienced by para-athletes. In particular, impairment-related factors remain insufficiently examined. Additionally, empirical evidence from non-Western contexts remain limited. Therefore, a more context sensitive and impairment specific investigation is needed. So this study addressed three primary research questions. First, we examine whether the timing of the impairment onset influences a developmental milestone in para athletes. Second, we investigate whether prior experience in able-bodied sports affect the progression within para sport. Finally, we explore the key barriers and the facilitators that shape para athletes' development within the Iranian context. So this study included 1880 elite Iranian para athletes. Participants represent 9 Paralympic disciplines and had achieved either national ranking or international competitive success. The mean age of the sample was 33.6 years, and approximately 45% of the athletes had congenital impairment, while 55% had acquired impairment across different life stages. Most participants had experience competing at the international level. So the sample demonstrated a heterogeneous impairment distribution. Limb deficiency represents the largest subgroup, followed by athletes classified under impairment muscle power. So most athletes report acquired impairment. However, early onset impairment were strongly dominant. Athletics was the most represented sport within the sample. The participants reflected diverse sport background. A substantial proportion reported international competitive experience. So, about the method part, a quantitative structured design was employed to examine the developmental pathway in para athletes. Data were collected using a modified version of developmental history of athlete questionnaires, adopted version of the developmental history of athletes questionnaire. So adopted specifically for the para sport context. Due to violation of the normality assumption, Non-parametric statistical tests were conducted, including Kruskal-Wallis and Mann-Whitney-U analysis. So 13 developmental milestones were analyzed, including sport entry, training patterns, and competitive progression. Athletes were categorized based on the impairment onset across 5 groups: congenital, pre-adolescence, adolescence, early adulthood, and adulthood. So about the part of the result regarding the question number 1, the analysis revealed a clear effect of the impairment onset on the developmental pathway. Significant differences were observed across 12 of 13 developmental milestones. So athletes with congenital impairments entered organized sport at earlier ages and reached competitive milestone more rapidly. In contrast, athletes with later onset impairment demonstrate delayed progression across multiple stages of development. This finding indicates that the impairment onset represents a significant factor shaping para-athlete development. The figure also illustrates the developmental timing difference across impairment onset groups. Athletes with earlier impairment onset consistently reach a key milestone at younger ages. In contrast, later onset groups showed delayed progression across the sport entry and competitive stages. The pattern remained consistent across the multiple developmental markers. So regarding the question number 2, the analysis examined whether prior participation in able-bodied sport influenced by parasport development the parasport development. The result indicate no statistically significant difference between athletes with and without prior able-bodied sport experience. Developmental milestone and progression patterns remain largely comparable across groups. This finding suggests that parasport development follows distinctive trajectories that are not necessarily accelerated by able-bodied sport background. So the analysis revealed multiple pathways into parasport participation. The most common entry route involved friends and relatives, highlighting the importance of informal social networks. Family connection also played a significant facilitating role. In contrast, institutional pathways such as school, rehabilitation centers, were less frequently reported. These findings suggest that informal social relationships remain central to parasport entry within this context. So about the barriers, athletes reported several persistent barriers throughout their developmental pathway. The most frequently cited challenges included the high cost of adaptive equipment and participation expenses, transportation difficulties, and limited access to suitable facilities were also common. Additionally, athletes identify constraints related to specialized coaching and support services. Importantly, these barriers were observed across multiple stages of development. So despite the barriers identified, athletes also reported several key facilitators supporting continued participation. The most prominent factors included personal motivation and a strong sense of achievement. Family and social support emerged as a critical source of encouragement and stability. Athletes also highlighted the role of competitive environment and coaching support. This finding suggests that the psychological factors play a vital role in sustaining long-term engagement. Athletes reported several persistent barriers through their developmental pathway. The most frequently cited challenges including the high cost of adaptive equipment and participation expenses, transportation difficulties, and limited access to the suitable facility were also common. Discussion. So the finding addressing the first research question indicate that impairment onset significantly influence developmental timing. Athletes with earlier impairment onset enter the sport at younger ages and achieve key developmental milestones more rapidly. These results are consistent with prior research suggesting that early exposure and early onset impairment may accelerate developmental process. However, while later onset athletes uh, demonstrate delayed sport entry, so progression patterns across competitive stages remain largely comparable. The findings suggest that impairment onset primarily affects developmental timing rather than the overall structure of progression. Collectively, the results support the perspective that power athlete development follows impairment, specific and context-dependent dynamics. So, findings that addressing the second research question indicate that prior able-bodied sport experience did not produce significant difference in the developmental progression. Athletes with and without able-bodied sport background demonstrate largely comparable milestone achievement patterns. This result challenges common assumption, suggesting that earlier able-bodied participation necessarily accelerates power sport development. Instead, the findings support the perspective that power sport development follows distinct trajectories shaped by impairment-specific demands and structural constraints. This result reinforces the notion that skill transfer between able-bodied and power sport contexts may not be automatic. So, finding related to the third research question emphasize that the persistent influence of structural barriers. Athletes consistently reported challenges associated with financial limitation, equipment costs, and transportation difficulties. These barriers were observed across multiple developmental stages, indicating systematic constraints rather than stage-specific issue. At the same time, psychosocial factors such as personal motivation and family support play important buffering roles. This result highlighting the dynamic interaction between individual level resilience and broader environmental condition. Collectively, the finding underscored the importance of the contextual and structural consideration within power athletes' development. So, about the limitation of the studies, several limitations should be acknowledged when interpreting these findings. First, the sample was relatively small and gender imbalanced, which may limit the generalizability of the results. Second, athletes with later onset impairment were underrepresented, potentially biasing findings toward early onset development experiences. So, third, the study relied on the self-reported developmental histories, which may introduce subjectively and recall bias. So finally, missing data on small subgroup sizes reduces statistical power, meaning that some meaningful effect may not have reached statistical significance. Despite this limitation, the study provides valuable context, specific insight into power athlete development. So thank you for your attention.